conflict in the Ukraine. We're gonna do it in small or relatively small pieces, about a half hour each. And this first one, which we're about to do, is we want to look at the global perspective, how the fighting, the war in Ukraine, kind of fits into a much larger picture, and that picture really is something that we don't see much, we don't hear much about, and where your starting point is on this conflict determines to a very great extent how you view the conflict. Briefly speaking, if you think that this war began on February the 24th, 2022, with the Russian military incursion into Ukraine, you have a certain view. It's hard not to have a certain view of cause and effect, of who's responsible, whatever. However, if you go back in time to the early 1990s, to 2007, to 2014, we have a whole different sense of this conflict. So there's the time factor that we want to look at, but also this is a war that's not just about Ukraine. It's much broader, and since we don't hear much of that,
Rob,
this is where we want to begin. Yes,
I think that is the objective for us to prove.
Yes,
that we have to contextualize this war into a much more wider global issue, and that becomes clear as we unpack a few concepts in the 3 or 4 consecutive programs that we have.
Okay, that's right. So for starters, Ibrahim, let's begin with what is the global context to which we are referring?
Well, to be honest, if we were to discuss the global context is the conflict between two ideological or what we call ontological worldview. On the one hand, the view that primarily advocated by United States and its European allies for a dominant power or single polar structure of the world politics or global politics. And the opposing point of view or worldview is that they are not going to accept this view, but they move into more United Nation consultative, multipolar, etc., worldview. This is the context under which the Ukrainian crisis has to be located. Otherwise, it doesn't give us the perspective and the clarity of vision that we want.
Yes, that's true. I want to add a couple things here about this difference between unipole and multipolar views of the world. First of all, the more I think about it, in terms of centers of power, centers of influence, call it what you like, we've been living in a multipolar world for a long time. This is not something that's just happened. We could go back, briefly to the 1970s when the United States formed the Trilateral Commission. Even there, we see that at the time, it was the Carter administration, that they understood that the United States was no longer, if you like, this super duper dominant power in the world. Moving forward, since the 1990s and beyond, there have been a whole series of if you like, regions in the world whose influence has grown. So of course there's a growth of the Chinese economy, Russian reconstruction. There's also very important and influential countries in the world. They're referred to today as the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And lately, I'm hearing that they're talking about maybe adding Argentina and one or two other countries in Latin America. So my point here is we have been living in a multipolar world for a long time. That's,
But let me interject,
yeah.
Rob.
Mm-hmm.
You see, after the Second World War, the international basis for global politics that was developed, although they paid lip service to what we call at least bipolar, which
All
was
right.
the Soviet Union and the West, but the basis of the Western worldview goes back way to the 16th and 17th century of what we call the Hobbesian world politics, and which required the world to be obedient to an unaccountable sovereign, empowered to decide all the social and the political issues in the world. That was the foundation under which United States operated. But the existence of the Soviet Union somehow clipped this and didn't allow it to take place. In 1990, with the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, United States found itself facing the opportune moment to to go back to that what they call it sometimes single power or ruled based order, whatever it is. And I've heard repeatedly from Biden and his foreign secretary talking about this rule-based order, which literally means allowing the United States to dictate to the rest of the world. This has been challenged repeatedly by other powers in the world, particularly the Russian, the Chinese, Indians, and some of those countries that you listed. I believe your statement at the beginning that we really need to contextualize the war, the conflict in Ukraine in this global challenge and global politics. Once we do that, then we can understand the reality, and our conclusion and assessment is going to be different than one coming from the United States being the most magnanimous power in the world, and the rest of the world are the enemy, Putin or somebody else.
Right.
You want to add anything with regard to 2007 or 2014 or anything else?
Yeah, I want to make 2 points. First, in response to the comments you just made about how far back we can speak of this. If you look at the development, and again, I'll try and make it brief, but if you look at the development of world capitalism from around the 15th century on, it always, in order to kind of glue to keep it together, we find historically that there was a country or power that became what is referred to as a hegemonic power. That is the leader of the show, so to speak. We can speak of the Dutch, we can speak of the British, and post World War II, we can speak of the United States. All right. I want to just talk about that moment for a minute, because at the end of World War II, after this incredible destruction that took place, when we talk about a global economy, what are we talking about? We're talking about the United States that dominated 80% of all production in the world. All right. That was, the rest of the world was, or much of the world, certainly Asia and Europe and parts of Africa were, and the Middle East suffered badly, and they had to be rebuilt. Fast forward already to the early 1980s. U.S. share of global production is down to about a third. Okay, production of Japan and Western Europe each has about a third, and now today those U.S. share of production is less than 20%. So
Rob, I
Yes.
think these are issues that we can discuss
Hmm.
as we unpack various other concepts in the coming order. But the, I think what we really need to focus upon is the statement that you made earlier, that to understand the crisis in Ukraine, we really need to go beyond this notion of Europe or Ukraine,
Oh,
Russia.
yes.
It
Yes.
has to be looked at within the global context. And the global context has been challenged even since its conception, 1945, 46, 47. We have the non-aligned movement, for example,
Right.
in 1955, where a number of leaders got together in Bandung, and from there they moved on to various other countries. That made it clear that they are not prepared to accept this Hobbesian worldview that allows United States to dictate to the rest of the world because it is the biggest military power, and they can define international law, international order, etc., etc. We saw this excuses that were given in 2002 and 2003 by United States when they violated the international law and institution by occupying other countries such as Iraq, Libya, or something else. So I think it will give us a better understanding of how to assess the situation if we were to look at it in this global perspective rather
I
than.
Yeah, I agree with you on this, Ibrahim. Very much so. In fact, really, if you really want to, kind of get to the heart of the matter, uh, the United States is simply trying to stop history. That's really what it's about. Uh, this notion is trying to maintain its control over a world where its influence has been reduced, and the only card that it's playing is the military card, and military card broadly speaking, whether we're talking about it invading itself, it using proxies, its use of sanctions, which are a form of warfare. Um, and we can see very clearly in U.S. documents they specify what the United States is trying to do. There's a national security document that came out in 2018. It specifically mentions it's stopping China and Russia from being effective competitors with the United States. Well, what does that have to do? Getting down to it uh, uh, to the Ukraine. Essentially, what Ukraine winds up being is one of the many, if you like, flashpoints or battlefields in this whole kind of wrestling match between the United States trying to maintain its global hegemony on the one hand, and those forces led by China and Russia, one might add, but there are others involved that are trying to make this world represent what it really is already,
Well,
a multipolar world.
you can go back to 2007, the speech that Putin gave, and analyze it, and you can detect the resentment that Russia has towards the dominance, the single power dominance of United States. You want to discuss that 2007, or you want?
Yes, I was telling you earlier. I've reread that speech today. I reread it several times. Um, I had read it when it came out originally, and then I haven't looked at it much since. But the reason I reread it is because so many commentators refer to it, and the way that commentators here in the United States, and the way they refer to it as a kind of angry challenge that Vladimir Putin was laying down, if you like, to the United States and the European powers. And what struck me in rereading it was how temperate the tone was, how quite frankly, conciliatory the tone was, looking for common ground, whether it had to do with nuclear arms treaties, whether it had to do with economic issues and trade with Europe. Of course, the speech was made in Munich, and this was about really Russian, European, American relations primarily. He does raise this issue of NATO expansions and makes it very clear that NATO expansions into Eastern Europe and into some of the former republics of the former Soviet Union, that this was seen as a very serious threat to Russian security, and the American response to that was almost childish. There were two parts to it.
Yeah. They have, Putin and others have every right to be fearful, not fearful, to be concerned of the role of NATO as well as the expansion of NATO and getting close to the Russian border, because from 2002, at least, if not before, from 2002, NATO has been used by United States and as an extended arm for its military activity, whether it was in Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Libya, or anywhere else. The notion that NATO is purely a defensive, European defensive structure to protect Europe is a fiction. NATO is as much an expansionist kind of a strategy as the United States foreign policy. And naturally for Putin and others, they become fearful of NATO getting close to its natural border. And they made it clear, he made it clear in 2007, hoping that the Americans and the Europeans would understand the concern. But unfortunately, as you said, it was somehow dismissed that, there is nothing, they didn't read it that this speech could lead into something more serious.
No, and now they didn't take it seriously.
They, United States and Europe, I'm sure you can elaborate on this. They have literally, with the latest report and so on, what they wanted to do and to weaken Russia, now they have weakened themselves economically and so on. You want to add on that?
Well, what I wanted, yes, I'll say something about that, but I wanted to go back. So first they said, don't worry, this is all defensive. This has nothing to do with you. While they're setting up, putting troops and missile launching systems and all that stuff closer and closer to the Russian border. But the other thing they said, do you remember, Ibrahim? They said, our militarization of Eastern and Central Europe is not about Russia. We're worried about Iran. That was the pretext that they gave, that there was an Iranian. So these pretexts were silly. They were not realistic. So that's that's the first point I want to make. Now, how to if you like, engineer this threat, and why Ukraine? Why Ukraine? Because really, what we're talking about here is, if you like, these two views of how international relations should take place: unipolar, the U.S. calls all the shot, or multipolar. And here, my take is the following: if you look at what the United States, what they see as the enemy, what's the main enemy? China. They're very clear about that. Russia they see as secondary, and they've said all up until a few weeks ago, how were they referring to Russia? They're referring to Russia as basically a gas station masquerading as a country, i.e., they completely underestimated the changes that have taken place in Russia. But they saw Russia if you like, as the weak link in this growing Chinese-Russian alliance. And so how to destabilize Russia or slow its progress, its economic, social progress, its alliance with China. And they saw the weak link in Ukraine. And let's keep in mind that the United States and NATO has been arming and training the Ukrainian military since 2014. All right, since 2000. In fact, it has gone so far that while we can say formally that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but American advisors have trained the Ukrainian military along NATO standards. Meaning what? Meaning a Ukrainian military unit can engage in maneuvers, and they're doing these NATO maneuvers all over the place, in the Baltic, in the Mediterranean, in the Black Sea, you name it. They can participate as if they are a member. So they actually, Ukraine is frankly a de facto member of NATO and has been so for some time.
In the case of Iraq, Ukrainian soldiers were part of a NATO unit operating in Iraq.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes. So when NATO began to wind down some of the Ukrainian, this is why in at least Iraq, there is no sympathy for what's happening in Ukraine. Iraqis are talking about, you deserve what you got. Look what you did to our country when you were part of NATO. So they are part of NATO. What's his name? Congressman Paul, in the speech that he gave, I believe yesterday, to Congress, made it clear how much money and how long the United States has been dealing with Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian military unit. Yes. Exercises, etc., etc. So, for all effective purposes, Ukraine was considered to be part of NATO or operated as part of NATO, and that is why Putin in 2007 made it clear, in 2014 made it clear, but unfortunately, United States was not prepared to listen.
No,
the image that they have. United States has of Russia is post-Yeltsin image, that a weak country that you can manipulate its leader, and it would succumb and capitulate to the demand of United States at will. So I think this is the basis where we have to start and see where we can go from here and how Ukraine fits into this global conflict. And ultimately, what would be the consequence of Russian strategy versus United States strategy? Already, according to all the documents, and even New York Times article and other article clearly indicating that contrary to the perception that they are going to weaken Russia, they are weakening themselves. The United States is in much dire economic circumstances than they were before.
Yes, I want to wait for another program to really get into this question of what's happening right now. But the bottom line to all this is what we're seeing in Ukraine is a proxy war, a proxy war in which the United States and NATO are basically trying. Well, they're not just trying to weaken Russia. Publicly, they've said it. They're hoping to create economic, social chaos and to overthrow the Putin government. So and in doing this, they hope to weaken the movement towards multilateralism. And maybe this is a good place to end it for tonight. The plans that Washington and NATO have had for Ukraine and for Russia are not working well. And the media frenzy and hysteria that we've seen is quite misleading. Quite misleading. But why don't we wait, Ibrahim, to go into that in more detail in the next program, because we've spoken for a little bit more, or right around a half an hour right now. Okay?
Sure.
Unless you have any final thoughts, anything you want to
No,
add at this point.
I tend to agree with you. International conflict or global conflict don't take place in vacuum. They have to take place it's framed in a context, and those contexts, there are factors that lead to it. Those must be analyzed and understood to be able to have a better assessment of what's going on.
All
rather
right.
than have a knee-jerk reaction while it is Putin or somebody else.
All right. So in closing down, sorry for the apologies for the confusion, the technical confusion in the beginning, but we got beyond that, I'd like to think, and I hope that you find this interesting and that the viewers will participate and listen in our next program. So thank you, and we'll say goodbye right now.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.